You're about to hear a story that doesn't just feel wrong, it stays with you because on the surface, it looks harmless at a young mother, smiling, relaxed, walking through an amusement park. The kind of place families go to make memories. The kind of place children beg to visit. And for a moment, if you didn't know anything else, you'd think everything in her life was perfectly fine. But here's what makes this story different. Her children weren't with her, not because they were at school, not because they were staying with relatives, but because they had been taken away, placed into foster care, removed from her custody. And that one detail changes everything, because suddenly, that smile doesn't look the same anymore, that laughter feels out of place, and the entire scene starts to feel uncomfortable in a way you can't quite ignore. According to reports, serious concerns had already been raised, allegations of neglect, claims that the children weren't being properly cared for, concerns about the living environment itself, enough for authorities to step in, enough for a decision to be made that no family ever wants to face. The children were removed, and while that reality was unfolding behind closed doors, she was seen out in public. A place designed entirely for children. That contrast is what people can't stop talking about because it forces a question that's hard to answer. How does someone carry on like that when everything is falling apart? And that's where this story starts to go deeper. Because when you look beyond that single moment, it doesn't feel isolated. It feels like part of something bigger. A pattern. A system. A way of handling things that, over time, starts to reveal itself piece by piece. People began noticing something unusual. Whenever controversy hits, whenever serious accusations begin to surface, there's a shift. Public outings, carefully chosen locations, moments that send a very specific message. Everything is normal, everything is fine, but is it? Oh, is it something else entirely? Because when the same type of response happens again, and again, and again, it stops looking like coincidence, and starts looking like strategy, and behind that strategy is control. Control of how the story is seen, control of what people focus on, control of the narrative. And that's where things get uncomfortable, because while the public sees smiles and normality, there are deeper questions being asked behind the scenes. Questions about responsibility, questions about accountability, questions about what's really happening when the cameras aren't there. And then there's the part that's hardest to understand, because despite everything, she stayed. No public separation. No visible distance. No clear break. Just loyalty. And that kind of loyalty, especially in situations like this, raises even more questions. Because it suggests something deeper than just a personal choice. It suggests influence, belief systems, expectations that go beyond what most people would consider normal. Environments where standing by your partner isn't just encouraged, it's expected. Where speaking out isn't just difficult, it's discouraged. And where walking away doesn't feel like an option, even when the situation demands it. Now here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Because this isn't the first time concerns like this have surfaced, there have been earlier admissions, past acknowledgements that troubling behavior existed within the wider family, and instead of direct confrontation, there were different approaches that focused less on accountability and more on containment, managing the issue, keeping it quiet, preventing it from becoming public. In some cases, fast decisions were made, life-changing decisions. Not necessarily because the situation was resolved, but because it was redirected. And when you hear insiders talk about patterns of behavior, repeated concerns, moments that raise red flags long before any public attention, it shifts the entire perspective. Because now, this isn't just about one situation anymore. It becomes something much bigger. A system where appearances are carefully maintained, where problems are handled internally, where image can sometimes take priority over reality. And that's what makes this story so difficult to ignore. Because when you step back and look at the full picture, it's not just shocking. It's unsettling, deeply unsettling. Because it forces you to ask, how much of what people see is real, and how much of it is carefully constructed? How many moments that look normal are actually covering something else entirely? And how many times has this pattern repeated without anyone fully realizing it? Because if there's one thing the story makes clear, it's that what's visible isn't always the truth. And what's hidden is often where the real story lives. And until those hidden parts are fully brought into the light, until accountability becomes unavoidable, until the focus shifts from image to reality, this cycle doesn't just continue. It repeats over and over again. And the most unsettling part, it can keep repeating right in front of everyone, while still going unnoticed. It starts with a moment that looks completely harmless at a mother walking through an amusement park. She's smiling, relaxed, almost carefree. If you saw her for just a few seconds, you wouldn't think twice. You'd assume she's there with her kids, making memories, enjoying a normal day out, but she wasn't. Her children weren't there, and the reason why changes everything, because those children, her own children, had already been taken away, removed from her custody, placed into foster care. Let that sink in for a second, while she was walking through a place built for laughter, for families, for children. Her own kids were somewhere else living with strangers. And suddenly, that image doesn't feel so normal anymore. It feels wrong, deeply wrong. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a short-term arrangement. This happened after serious concerns were raised, allegations that no parent ever once attached to their name, claims that the children weren't being properly cared for, that basic needs weren't consistently met, that the home environment itself had become a problem, enough for authorities to step in. Enough for a decision that changes lives instantly. The children were removed, and while all of that was unfolding, she was seen smiling, laughing, blending into a crowd of families who had no idea what was really going on. That contrast is what makes the story so difficult to ignore, because it forces a question most people don't want to ask. How do you act normal when your children are gone? How do you walk through a place filled with kids, knowing yours aren't with you? And that's where things start to feel unsettling. Because according to people who saw her that day, nothing seemed out of place. No visible distress. No urgency. No sign of someone fighting to fix what had just happened. Just normal. And sometimes that's what makes it worse, because when the situation is this serious, normal doesn't make sense. And the more you think about it, the more questions start to build. Questions that don't have easy answers. But this story doesn't stop there, because when you zoom out, when you stop focusing on just that one moment, a pattern begins to appear. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every time controversy hits, every time something serious surfaces, there's a shift. Public appearances, carefully chosen settings, moments that send a message without saying a word. Everything is fine, everything is under control. But is it? Or is it something else entirely? Because when the same response happens again and again, it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like strategy. A way to shape perception. A way to control what people see, and more importantly, what they don't. And right at the center of it all is a kind of loyalty that raises even more questions, because despite everything that's happened, she hasn't stepped away, she hasn't created distance, she hasn't broken from the situation. She stayed. And that decision might be the most revealing part of this entire story, because it suggests something deeper, something that goes beyond one moment, one incident, one choice. It points to a system. An environment where certain expectations are deeply ingrained, where standing by your partner isn't just encouraged, it's expected, where questioning isn't easy, and walking away feels almost impossible, even when everything around you is telling you that something isn't right. And that's where this story begins to shift from one moment to something much bigger, because what you're looking at here might not just be a single situation. It might be part of a pattern that's been repeating for years, quietly, carefully, hidden behind images that look completely normal on the outside, but tell a very different story underneath. And in the next part, what starts to come out is even more unsettling, because once past details begin to surface, and insiders start connecting the dots, the picture becomes impossible to ignore. And this is where everything starts to feel calculated. Because once you step back from that single moment at the amusement park, a much bigger picture begins to take shape. A pattern that doesn't look accidental. It looks repeated, almost rehearsed. Every time serious accusations begin to surface, every time attention starts building, something else happens at the exact same time. Public appearances, carefully chosen locations, moments that seem designed to send one very clear message: nothing is wrong, everything is normal. But when that same response shows up again and again, it stops feeling natural and starts feeling controlled. Because this isn't just about being seen in public. It's about where you're seen, places that represent something, places that carry a certain image: wholesome, family-focused, safe, the kind of environments that instantly shape how people perceive you. And when those appearances line up perfectly with moments of controversy, it raises a serious question: is this real life, or is it damage control? Because behind the scenes, a very different story seems to be unfolding. more details begin to surface, more questions start being asked, and slowly, the narrative begins to crack. There are reports of growing evidence, information that doesn't just disappear, claims that don't just go away, and the more those pieces come together, the harder it becomes to ignore what might actually be happening. But here's where it gets even more uncomfortable, because while all of this is building, while the situation is becoming more serious, the response stays the same. No visible panic, no public urgency, no clear sign of accountability, just silence, and carefully controlled normality. And that silence, it speaks louder than anything else, because when something this serious is happening, silence doesn't calm people. It makes them question even more. What's being hidden, what's being avoided, and why does everything look so controlled? Then there's another detail that doesn't quite add up, reports suggesting that she had been struggling, that she wasn't feeling strong, that even basic functioning had become difficult, and yet, she had the energy to spend an entire day out walking, smiling, engaging. That contradiction is hard to ignore, because it doesn't line up unless the exhaustion wasn't physical, unless it came from something else entirely, something heavier, something that makes a person shut down, instead of step up. And that brings us back to the one decision that keeps standing out. She stayed, despite everything. No distance, no separation, no visible break. And when you look at that choice closely, it starts to feel less like a simple decision, and more like something shaped by pressure. By expectation. By an environment where certain roles are fixed, and certain actions are expected. No matter what. And once you start looking at it that way, the story changes again. Because now, this isn't just about what happened. It's about why it happened, why certain decisions were made, why certain reactions never came. Why everything feels so controlled, even when it shouldn't. And as more information begins to surface, as past concerns quietly come back into focus, one thing becomes clear: this didn't start here, and it definitely doesn't end here. Because in the next part, the story goes even deeper into past admissions, past warnings, and patterns that were noticed long before any of this became public. And once those details come out, what looks shocking now starts to look like something that was building for a long time. And this is where the story stops being about one moment and starts revealing something much bigger, because once you go back, once you start looking at what was said years earlier, a completely different picture begins to form. There were admissions, quiet ones, not widely talked about at the time, but impossible to ignore now, acknowledgments that concerning behavior existed within the family. Not just one situation, not just one person, multiple concerns, multiple warnings, and yet, what followed wasn't what most people would expect. There was no full transparency. No clear accountability. No structured intervention that addressed the root of the problem. Instead, everything stayed contained, handled internally, managed quietly, and that decision, to keep things inside, may be one of the most important pieces of this entire story, because when issues aren't fully addressed, they don't disappear, they evolve. They resurface, sometimes in ways that are even more serious than before. And according to those familiar with what was happening behind the scenes, there were patterns that raised real concern, behaviors that weren't isolated, moments that stood out, not once, but repeatedly, interactions that crossed boundaries, comments that made people uncomfortable, and situations that should have triggered immediate action, but didn't. And that's where the story becomes harder to process, because when those early warning signs appeared, they were known, they were acknowledged, but instead of being confronted directly, they were redirected, minimized, explained away, and in some cases, solved with decisions that didn't actually solve anything. Because rather than addressing the behavior itself, the focus shifted to controlling it, containing it, managing it in a way that kept everything looking stable on the outside. And one of the clearest examples of that was how quickly life-changing steps were introduced. Sudden changes, new environments, distance. And then, marriage, not as a natural progression, not as a carefully considered choice, but as a response. A way to create structure. A way to impose responsibility. A way to prevent things from escalating further. And when you really think about that, it raises serious questions. Because marriage isn't supposed to be a solution to a problem. It's not meant to fix behavior. It's not meant to act as containment. And yet, in this situation, that's exactly how it appears to have been used. And the more insiders speak, the more consistent those patterns start to sound. Concerns that were known early, handled quietly, followed by rapid decisions designed to shift attention away from the issue itself. And when you connect all of those dots, it becomes impossible to ignore what this might actually represent. Because now, this isn't about one family member. It's not about one moment. It's about a system where problems are managed instead of solved, where image is protected, even when reality is far more complicated, where difficult truths are kept behind closed doors until they can't be hidden anymore, and by the time they do come out, the damage has already been done. And that's what makes this part of the story so unsettling, because it suggests that what we're seeing now isn't new. It's the result of something that's been building for years, quietly, carefully, out of public view, until now. And in the next part, everything comes together. Because once you step back and look at the full picture, the present, the past, the patterns, the decisions, it leads to one unavoidable conclusion. This isn't just a series of unfortunate events. It's a cycle, and understanding that cycle might be the most important piece of all. And when you put everything together, the picture becomes almost impossible to ignore, because this was never just about one outing. It was never just about one family moment that looked strange from the outside. It was about everything underneath it. The patterns, the decisions, the silence, and the way every serious situation seemed to follow the same path, contained, controlled, and carefully managed. At first glance, it might look like coincidence, but when coincidence keeps repeating the same way, it starts to feel like something else, something structured, something deliberate. And that's what makes this so uncomfortable to think about. Because while the outside world sees smiles, and public appearances, and carefully chosen moments of normality, there's another layer that never fully comes into view. A layer where decisions are made behind closed doors, where problems are not always openly addressed, and where image often speaks louder than reality. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of all. Not just what happened, but how long it stayed hidden beneath the surface. How many moments passed that looked completely normal, but weren't. And how many signs were there that only made sense in hindsight, because once you see the pattern, you can't really unsee it. And it forces a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. How much of what people see is actually the truth? And how much of it is just what they're meant to see? Because in stories like this, the most important parts are never always the loudest. Sometimes, they're the ones hidden in plain sight, and the cycle continues until something finally breaks it.